Hello, my name is Matt Talbert. I am the research manager at ASCM. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar topic is Digital Supply Chain Transformation, Visualizing Possibilities. Our presenters are Nada Sanders and Morgan Swink.
Hi, my name is Nada Sanders. I hold the title of Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at the DeMar McKim School of Business at Northeastern University in Boston.
Hello, everyone. I'm Morgan Swink. I hold the West Chair. It's a research chair of supply chain management at the Neely School down at TCU. And I also am the executive director of our Center for Supply Chain Innovation. Good to be with you today.
So I'm going to kick this off and tell you a little bit about our research, digital supply chain transformation, visualizing the possibilities. And before we actually get into the findings, I thought it would be very good to let you know what has motivated this study. Now, we all know there are numerous trends that are fueling a digital supply chain revolution. We see big data, we see how highly instrumented supply chains are becoming with the Internet of Things. We see advances in computing, robotics, 3D printing, automated warehouses. So due to all these technological breakthroughs, there's a tremendous amount of hype surrounding them. And many supply chain leaders are viewing digitization really as a mandate in order to compete. But for most of them, the first steps and the overall strategy on what to do and how to proceed is unclear. So the important questions that we felt were to begin with defining the digital supply chain. What does it really mean to have a digital supply chain? And what are the core elements? Also, we wanted to identify opportunities and challenges and key enabling technologies that make this happen and establish where companies really stand compared to all the hype that we all see. And finally, how do they move forward? So that was the motivation for this research. And in order to provide answers to these questions, we conducted in-depth interviews with senior executives at more than a dozen firms, covering a wide range of industries. We included healthcare and retail and aerospace, transportation, pharma. And all these firms, I have to note, are leaders in their respective industry segments. And our findings were able to reveal where these firms stand along their journey in terms of digital transformation, the challenges they're uncovering, and the strategies for overcoming them. So that is what Morgan and I are going to be talking to you about here today. So if we first begin with the term digital transformation, and you can see here how popular this term is just by looking at Google searches for the term, and you could see how much they have skyrocketed. Look, it's pretty flat around 2013, 2014, and then it rapidly, you see this curve growing. So we wanted to find out, what is this? What does the term really mean? And we asked our responders, the companies that we interviewed, the leaders, we asked them, what is a digital supply chain? And here are some of the answers that we found. What does it mean to you? Well, somebody said it's digitizing all transactions. Somebody said connecting transactions and sharing plans electronically with partners, replacing people with electronics and computing power, data communication, replacing verbal, manual, power-based processes. Somebody said eliminating information flow gaps, adding transparency. Somebody said better visibility and tracking. The thing that was evident for us is that there was this huge variation, as you can see. It has different meanings to different people. So what we wanted to do was draw out a common element. The common element for us, what we were able to see and what defined the term for us, is that it means digitizing all transactions and communication. And we also asked respondents where they were in their journey. And we asked, where are you in this journey to maturity? Think again about all the hype that we've seen. And we were really surprised to see so many respondents saying, well, we're actually in infancy. We don't have a strategy yet. And then somebody said, no, 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 we don't have a well-defined roadmap. We again repeated, no strategy. Don't have a guiding strategy. It was something we kept on hearing over and over again. And remember, again, that all the companies we spoke with, they're leaders. They're all household names. These are all companies that each one of you listening would know. So that's where we were. We said, hey, there are some commonalities to the term. We were able to define it. And we see that most companies felt they were behind in their journey. So what were the key findings, the key output from our study? Well, we're happy to report, as you can see on the slide, is that we have one paper that was published. It came out in Supply Chain Management Review in January of this year, and it summarizes our key findings. But we have since gone beyond that, and we're going to share that with you. The first thing that we were able to achieve is to differentiate between hype versus reality. And as I've already shared with you, that there is a tremendous amount of hype. We were surprised that most business leaders are still trying to grapple with terms of what to do and how to proceed, and each one of them feeling that they're really behind the curve on what all of us see in the popular press. What we were able to uncover is that this indeed is hype. It's not really what is happening in companies across the globe. Two, one of the findings, and we will go into this, Morgan will go into this a little bit more deeper later in the webinar, but the difference between solutions versus capabilities. What we found is that there were a few companies that were leading that seemed to kind of stand out from all the ones that we had interviewed. And those were the ones that were looking at technology, not in terms of mere solutions, but rather the kinds of capabilities it would provide to the company to compete in their respective marketplace, where solutions is a very short-sighted, band-aiding kind of a way. So one of the key differentiators, again, solutions to solve immediate problems, very short-sighted. A bigger picture is to actually use technology to create capabilities. And third is to have plans versus strategies. We saw the majority of companies having short-term plans in terms of what to do and how to proceed. But a few of the ones that, again, rose above the pack were those that had broader, long-term strategies that went beyond these short-term plans, short-term payback periods, and so forth in terms of the technology, but saw it in terms of these longer-term strategies and overall capabilities. So our contribution of this research was, one, definition of digital transformation, the core attributes of a digital supply chain that I'm going to share with you here in next slide. And so framework and a maturity model that Morgan will get into. And Morgan will also explain the agile roadmap template that we were able to ultimately create. And that goes beyond the paper that you see here on the screen, where our research has moved to and has evolved. So before we move forward, what Morgan and I were able to do was create an overall template in terms of the enabling digital supply chain technologies. I think there's confusion. We hear about CRM and 3D printing and TMS and APS and so forth. So what we wanted to do was put this together in some kind of a categorization that will really help business leaders be able to see the various capabilities and categorize the various technologies. The first of these is analytics decision technologies. You can see it's really sort of, the thinking part of the human brain, if you will. It provides the computing power, the intelligence, and the data management to make higher quality decisions. This is things like machine learning, network design, advanced planning systems. But then we can get into processing technologies, and this is really sort of the muscle, if you will. These are the software robots and 3D printing and flexible manufacturing system. And collectively, these are tools that automate transactions, material processing, and really give us that 24/7 availability for faster processing, reducing cost, improved consistency, efficiency. It is the muscle, if you will. And third, communication technologies. These are the ones that connect us. You can see they're the voice, the eyes, the ears, and they create greater accuracy, currency, connectivity. These are the sensors, the RFID tags that talk to one another, the internet, Wi-Fi, satellite, fiber optics, EDI, all of it. And then the last categorization is these integrated platforms that really combine all this. And you can see they're sort of combined in the one human, the one person. And this is combining data management, communication, visibility, decision support, traceability, all of it together. Examples are cloud computing, the blockchains that everyone's talking about, platforms, and so forth. So now you can kind of collectively see what we mean by these technologies. One of the findings that I had already mentioned that's very important is that digital supply chain transformation is about capabilities. It is not about solutions. In particular, it's about combining insight plus automation in order to really advance, really advance the customer experience, integrating intelligence, agility, visibility, efficiency that work in tandem in this sort of circular way. Some of the technologies, as you can see, focus on efficiency. Others give us visibility. But we want intelligence as well. Efficiency by itself doesn't really give us the full picture of this digital, visible supply chain. We want agility. And again, one feeds on to the other. Here are the core attributes that make a digital supply chain. And it's really important to note that just like with the previous slide, one feeds into the other. The first step is becoming digitized. It's the data aspect of it. The sensing, capturing, standardizing. It used to be some years ago where companies didn't have enough data. Today, we have more data than we need. But one of the things that leaders are struggling with is making sure that the data is actually clean. We found in our interviews that only a small fraction of the data available actually meets usable criteria. We were also not able to find a single company that actually had digitized data available in real time. This is immediately when it's captured, but it's one of the first steps. It is actually the first step and a critical element of becoming a digital supply chain, is having that data in a clean form. And again, we found that none of the companies had that in real time. That's the number one and the first step. Once we have the data, well, what we need is information. So data by itself isn't enough. We want insights. We want to be able to connect everybody through some kind of a reporting structure, combining, filtering to actually connect the various elements within the organization and with suppliers, customers to then actually have a connected supply chain. Then with that connected data, we want insights and intelligence. We want to be able to visualize. We want to be able to diagnose, predict. So the technology at this point is layered beyond mere connectivity to actually provide insights, intelligence that goes beyond merely summarizing and organizing data. And last aspect here is it needs to be adaptive. Predictions in analytics are only accurate in the short term. Supply chains have to adapt. And so this value that we have from the data and the supply chain is only useful if we have the ability to be able to respond, to alert, to orchestrate and reconfigure in real time. And in order for all of this to actually happen, to make this happen, what we also need is we need the organization to have the right structure, to have the right infrastructure, to have the right talent in order to be able to support all these efforts. So here on the slide, you can see we have the integration in order for all this to happen, the integration of the system, the structure, and the various roles. We also need intellectual capital. We need to focus on that in order for these connections to take place, particularly when we move to intelligence and having an adaptive system, integration of talent with the knowledge and having the right skills to be able to create this ultimate integration. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Morgan to tell you a little bit about the Agile roadmap.
Thanks, Nada. So that was an overview of what we found in talking to these different companies and the model that we developed from those conversations. And as you can see, it really tries to capture the essence of what digital transformation is and what a maturity model and different stages of maturity might look like. One of the other things that Nada mentioned that came from our discussions was this lack of an overarching vision or strategy and more specifically a roadmap for how to move toward a maturity, whatever maturity looked like in particular for a given company. And actually, this isn't unusual. We did a little research in the literature and found Gartner has done some studies in this area, and they did a survey back to 2 years ago, and the most cited roadblock to digital transformation was this lack of an overall roadmap. That was the #1 response that over 600 respondents gave as kind of the barrier to getting there. And then in another study, they said, well, who's driving the roadmap for digital transformation in the supply chain? And about 1/3 of the respondents said, well, if there is any kind of roadmap, the specific supply chain functions, procurement, transportation, logistics, manufacturing, they have their own roadmaps. There's no integrated roadmap. About 1 in 4 of the respondents said, well, we have a chief supply chain officer and there is a centralized plan. About 1 in 5 of the respondents said, well, it's housed in some functional area, either the chief development officer or CIO or the chief technology officer has some kind of a plan. It's spread out all over the place. So the takeaway is that there's a need for a more disciplined, structured, and strategic process for roadmaps. So again, we looked out there to see what is in the popular domain, and there's not really anything there that satisfies many of the wants or the needs of a good road mapping process. There's a lot of different selection from frameworks, around evaluating different technology options and selections. But what we want is a roadmap that addresses things more strategically, thinks about opportunities in terms of capabilities rather than just specific technology options or solutions, and incorporates a vision and also the project management aspect of transformation. We'd really like a portfolio development process and a technology selection process to be driven by a higher order strategy that incorporates some forecasts of future technology changes and also thinks about insourcing and outsourcing, what we try to do on our own and what we try to do with partners. So what we're going to show you today is just a part of the roadmap that we're developing. The overall road mapping process we have determined needs to reflect a lot of different perspectives. Most processes that have been developed tend to take this functional perspective that we'll take a look at very quickly. But as I mentioned in the prior slide, a complete road mapping template needs to also think about partnerships, about systems and data, about specific projects and how they relate to each other in a portfolio way. As Nada mentioned earlier, we can't really talk about transformation without talking about organizational change and talent acquisition and the management of intellectual property and learning through the process. We're going to focus a lot on the capabilities piece of this, and then of course overarching strategy needs to guide any changes. So if we take a look first at some of the functional templates that are out there, and these are already existing. This one comes from BCG, just a way of organizing different technology options around functional areas. This is kind of a classic way of looking at the supply chain as, in this case, 6 different functional areas and trying to think about technology options and solutions. Another functional perspective, again, Gartner's done some work in this space, and they've come up with this matrix that organizes the supply chain functions across the top row here, and then different layers of capability, which kind of similar to our capability map that I'll show you a little bit in a little more detail in just a minute. But by doing this, you can think about different areas of impact, different processes that might span different functions across the supply chain, and then think about what is it we're trying to do with those processes in terms of overall sensing and responding to changes in supply and to changes in demand. So those are good functional perspectives that can be used. If we think about projects, and this is where I should say we've done a couple of in-depth case study types of research with 2 companies right now, and we've gotten to gain some insight into the specific projects that these companies are pursuing and how they relate to each other. And so a key challenge is, how do you manage these projects truly as a portfolio and think about the ways that they relate to each other? So this is the project's perspective that one might use, and it's kind of a typical Gantt chart type representation. But here we're talking about projects as opposed to tasks and how those projects might relate to each other. And in this particular company's case, they divide their supply chain up into 3 major functional areas: stores, which is inventory management mainly, supplier management, and materials planning. And then we have this other category of projects called foundational, which really are, in this case, they have 1 project in that area that addresses kind of structural information system types of capabilities that may create opportunities for other projects. So you can see here, this is just a simple way of graphically depicting the different projects, and these are all active projects that are ongoing or planned in this company's case. The key thing that you see here is the relationship among the projects in the different functional areas. What's not very evident here, what may be kind of lacking, and this is one of the feedbacks that we gave to the company, is that there's not a lot of cross-functional effort here. It seems like many of these projects are very functionally focused, with the exception of this analytics gallery, which is at least feeding some of the materials planning effort. But the big takeaway from our discussions with them about their projects, and we looked at each one of these projects and what its goals were and what technologies were going to be incorporated and what organizational changes were required. So we went in depth in discussing these, but there does seem to be a pretty functionally siloed effort going on here. Not a lot of bigger picture end-to-end kind of supply chain projects or initiatives, and that's what a road mapping template like this might point out. The other dimension that I'll talk about just very in a little more depth, but still fairly briefly, is this capabilities focus. And again, Nada mentioned that, you know, if there's really one big takeaway, that's what an encouragement that we would give to folks who are thinking about supply chain transformation. It's to not get too caught up in solutions to the specific problems, or to become too enamored with any specific technology. And I know that's easy to do with so many consultants offering so many different types of technological solutions, but to think more strategically and more broadly about the capabilities that you're trying to develop in your supply chain. And of course, those capabilities need to be addressing key concerns and opportunities and aligned with the higher level kind of business strategies that are driving the organization. So the way we're thinking about capabilities here goes back to the two basic underlying outcomes or abilities that supply chain transformation, digital transformation gives, and Nada mentioned earlier. That's insight and automation. So if you boil everything down to those two key things, you can start to think about how different initiatives or projects or technologies build greater insight or capture opportunities for automation within your supply chain. And combinations of insight and automation of different stages of work, different functional areas, can create, again, these four basic capabilities that Nada mentioned earlier: increased visibility, increased efficiency, greater intelligence, and then ultimately greater agility in combining both insight and automation. And what does automation give you ultimately? Well, it gives you this 24/7 availability of resource. But as you think about automating more and more of the process of capturing data, analyzing data, making decisions, and then acting on those decisions across this bottom x-axis here, what you're gaining is speed, is consistency in processes, and accuracy in terms of the data and the information that you're acting upon. If you think about material automation out here on the acting end of the spectrum, we're getting, again, more consistency and perhaps cost reductions through labor savings and other kinds of maybe transactional savings if we're eliminating transactions or automating through software, robotic process automation, things like that, ways to eliminate work. On the insight side, what are we gaining? Well, this is where if you looked at analytics very much, you know there's different levels of analytics. There's description, there's visualization, there's prescription and prediction. Those levels, that's what we're trying to convey here on the y-axis in terms of increasing levels of insight. If you think about all the different initiatives that are out there and different solutions that consultants might talk to you about, they tend to fit on this 2x2 matrix in terms of they can be placed here in terms of their key contributions, either in improving the insight into processes and operations, or the efficiency or the timeliness or accuracy of them through automation. A lot of companies, most of the companies that we have talked to, seem to be in this lower left-hand quadrant space of visibility. A lot of their efforts are around capturing data more reliably with greater integrity and fidelity, and then structuring that data in some more automated and efficient way, and then reporting and alerting decision makers using that data. But there's a whole world of opportunities that can be built upon that basis or that foundation of visibility. And I'll give you a few examples of those in this next slide. So in that visibility space, one of the companies, these are not companies that we talk to particularly, these are examples from the popular press. Many of you may know IPC. That is the parent company that owns Subway restaurants, one of the largest restaurant chains in the United States at least, but they are a global company. They're one of the leaders in terms of improving visibility on the supply side of things, track and trace, and even transparency. And they've spent a lot of money and a lot of time in trying to improve visibility upstream through distributors and manufacturers and packagers throughout the supply chain. They found that their, for example, their recall processes, if there's a quality or a safety problem with a food item in their stores, the recall processes were very, very inefficient because of their inability to track and trace where certain food items came from and the different handling steps and packaging steps. And these inefficient processes where they had to recall maybe an item at an entire region or in the entire network when actually the problem was only in a few local areas, very inefficient, and there's potential millions of dollars at stake in terms of overtime and multiple recalls. So they've made a lot of investments in adopting GS1 barcoding standards and improving barcoding and data capture and systems management processes up and down the supply chain, working with a partner. Food Logic is their partner in this case. So they're one of the leaders in that industry in terms of being able to track and trace items throughout their system and finally into the individual stores where the items are sold. So that's an example of increased visibility and a focus on that capability. Cemex is another great example that's more focused on adding to the visibility aspect, automation. So Cemex, maybe some of you are familiar with them, one of the largest providers of concrete and cement raw materials for construction projects of all kinds around the world. They are a Mexican owned company. They decided that they needed to differentiate themselves from their competitors in what is considered to be a commodity type market by improving the overall customer experience. Now, the customer in this case is the project manager on site at construction sites. And they wanted to give project managers the ability to make last minute changes to orders, to the quantities ordered, the delivery locations, and also give them a chance to manage questions and billing issues and other kinds of things through their mobile, handheld devices. So they worked with IBM to create a suite of 8 different apps that these project managers can use to answer all these kinds of questions and to change plans as the needs of the project require at very late decision points within the overall project. And working with IBM to do this, they not only, again, improved this overall user experience, they were able to cut about 35% of the labor required to manage accounts receivable and accounts payable and their help desks and call centers within. So automation in this case, automating transactions and putting customized automated solutions in the hands of the consumer or the user in this case, were a way to not only improve internal efficiencies, but to create differential value that really differentiates them from other providers in this marketplace. In terms of a more intelligence-based play or approach to applying technologies in the supply chain space, Lennox provides a great story of that. Lennox is air conditioning and heating units. You're probably familiar with them. They sell both commercial and residential equipment. And one of their big challenges was spare parts. And of course, if any of you work in that space or you know anything about spare parts, you know it's one of the most challenging supply chain areas to manage, because the forecasts of what parts are going to be needed and in what volumes and in what locations is very, very difficult. So they worked with a partner, Tools Group is the name of the solution provider, to develop a set of machine learning based forecasting tools, but more than forecasting, predictive in the larger sense tools around managing their service and spare parts networks. And at the same time, they were trying to improve their overall service levels to corporate customers and residential customers around North America. So they were opening additional distribution centers and service centers while they were at the same time trying to improve their forecasting ability and predictive ability for service needs. And by developing this machine learning based tool, which really used weather information and weather forecasts to develop about 200 different microclimate zones within the United States, and their different seasonal timing variations, they were able to increase service levels by 16% and at the same time reduce inventory by 25%, which is actually pretty massive given that they were increasing the number of different stocking locations at the same time. So huge improvements by applying the intelligence that machine learning can apply in this space, a space where you have really end of the tail types of products, very highly volatile and low volume demands for any given item. The last quick example to kind of fill out this matrix is Nike. I will use Nike, and they're really just an example of a larger trend within the larger apparel industry toward speed. You've heard fast fashion. Nike has made several different moves to try to become more agile and more customized in their solutions, and digital transformation is a huge enabler of this overall strategy. Part of it is nearshoring, so they have moved more of their production facilities and dealing with suppliers who are closer to the U.S., if not within the U.S. Borders. But in addition to that, they had partnered for a while with Flex. You may know that company. It's a contract manufacturer. I've heard that partnership is actually dissolved now, but they're working with partners like Flex to try to create more automation in their manufacturing sites, and 3D printing is a huge part of that. And you may have heard about this in the news, that they're able to 3D print many of their different types of footwear and tennis shoes in particular, so that they can be very responsive. The other part of it is to create many different types of channels and modes for delivery. So they're going to be selling through Amazon now as an additional channel, but they have different, in addition to the delivery systems and transportation options that Amazon, an online retailer like Amazon, can provide, they're looking at other ways to get product to consumers at home, and not only through direct stores, but through home deliveries. So overall, their missions to try to give consumers more choices and have those delivered to them faster. And that's requiring a combination of automation, both in the manufacturing step and the transaction processing step, the order taking, the order fulfilling step, and some smart tools in terms of being able to predict demand and then to respond to demand. So the smart tools come in place in terms of response, in terms of choosing the optimal mode of delivery. So this is where intelligence can be applied to try to get capacity on demand as needed to deliver solutions to consumers. If we go back to the company that I alluded to a minute ago and try to use this template to identify how their projects are creating capabilities in these 4 quadrants, we can take those projects that I showed on the project template a minute ago and plot them on this template. And again, you can see, if you look at these projects, many of them are kind of in the visibility space. Scorecards, dashboards, alert systems of different types. And again, we see this as typical. This is kind of where supply chain organizations tend to start. If they don't have good visibility, they tend to latch onto these opportunities to create better visibility of what's going on, both in the supply base and in internal processes. And that's a natural place to start. But what we'd want to encourage companies to do and organizations to do is to build beyond these original visibility opportunities and think about ways to, once you've got data captured and in better, current data, accurate data, usefully formatted data, that creates the foundation then to apply greater intelligence and predictive and even prescriptive capability in that dimension. And then as you know more about how processes are operating, that opens up opportunities for greater efficiency. But ultimately, we want companies to be thinking about this upper right-hand quadrant. And this corresponds to the right-hand column on our maturity model, the agile supply chain, where we can think about how to respond quickly to changes in customer demand or to changes in the availability of supply, and how we can even think about changing sources of supply or changing sources of production or sources of delivery in an on-demand, capacity on-demand type of fashion. So that's a very quick overview of our capabilities part of the overall road mapping template. I want to hand it back over to Nada now and have her talk a little bit about some of the bigger picture takeaways and future projects in our research.
Thank you, Morgan. And as those of you are listening, you can see that we have a lot of lessons, but the balance between insight and automation is really critical. The roadmap towards becoming agile is going to be very different, as you can see the stories with IPC and CEMEX and Lennox and Nike. And a lot of it is obviously driven by their business environment, Nike being in fast fashion, CEMEX being in a commodity, which is a very different environment. So what we could see is that one size does not fit all. But what we were looking for is to gain some lessons and to have some key takeaways for you guys from the current research, and also looking into some future projects. So the first aspect here that we have is that what the first lesson that the first takeaway, if you will, from the current work is the importance of putting someone in charge with a guiding coalition. As you saw with the example that Morgan had shared with you, is that there needs to be a relationship among the projects. The companies that we had looked at and taken a deep dive in, you can see there were many tasks that were being done, but grouping them into projects was key, and looking for some kind of a cross-functional effort to actually have coordination rather than having these silos that were working in parallel. And a lot of times what we found is that there really wasn't communication and there was duplication of effort. So when you have this duplication of effort, each group or each task is kind of moving forward, but the organization itself is not doing that. So someone being in charge, for example, one approach would be to have a steering committee that would actually manage this portfolio. We've seen examples of creating, say, a center of excellence that directly reports to the chief supply chain officer. We've seen examples of this with Cisco and Schneider and some of the other leading companies. But someone or some entity that actually guides this, rather than having these isolated random efforts towards technology innovation that are siloed. That's a problem. The way to alleviate, again, is to have some kind of oversight. One example would be a steering committee. Another issue to keep in mind is the importance of the customer and the guiding vision, the overall vision, the overall strategy. That was clearly illustrated through the examples, again, of Lennox and Cemex and Nike, and what their customers were demanding. The kind of product that we're seeing varies, and that in turn has a very different mandate in the kind of technology that the company is going to need and how it's going to be using it. The third lesson from the current work is thinking capabilities rather than solutions. And as Morgan had said, if there was only one key takeaway that you would get from this, is remember that you're trying to build capabilities, not being short-sighted, trying to put out fires and addressing individual solutions. Rather, you need capabilities, and you need to have these projects and a management of projects that are coordinated, and there is a cross-functional effort. Fourth item is to drive towards an end-to-end visibility and create strategic differentiators. Again, we are talking about digital supply chains. We are talking about connectivity on the downstream side with customers, as we saw with Cemex, delivery with Nike. We are talking about upstream, as we saw in the IPC example, as we saw with Lennox. And so being able to create this end-to-end visibility on both sides is ultimately what we are striving for. Fifth lesson is to prioritize the organization, the entire organization, people and processes, along with technology. When we spoke to the leaders in our study, one of the things that was repeated every single time, without exception, when we asked what was your biggest problem, every company said organizational change. Every single company. And that is the case whether we were talking to companies in retail or in aerospace or in pharma. It didn't matter. Every single company said it had to do with organizational change and integrating people and processes with the technology. And remember that if you're just acquiring technology, trying to solve a particular problem, looking at a solution, which you're essentially band-aiding, and you are solidifying bad processes, people will sabotage the system, as we've seen. So you have to integrate the three together. You have to prioritize that organization along with technology. And last but not least is to capitalize on the opportunities created by other organizational initiatives. And that comes full circle with the first current lesson, putting someone in charge. So if someone has a vision of all the different projects, this entity, whether it's a steering committee, can put them together and capitalize on the various initiatives that are going on within the organization. So what are the next steps? As you can see, we believe that we have been able to come up with some key lessons, separate the hype from reality, and really begin to look toward what companies can actually do in terms of moving forward. So what are the next steps that that companies can do, and the next steps in our research. Where is our research going? Well, one of the things that we have been talking about is some formal integration with the Digital Score Task Force workstream and the overall digital readiness assessment. Is there a way that we can do some formal integration with what we have found with this with the SCORE workstream? We're looking forward to roadmap development, case studies, and a deeper template that would really go into more details in terms of how companies proceed and what they're going to do as they move through this digital transformation process. Our work, we think, now needs to go deeper as well in refining that maturity model. As we can see, it's going to be a little bit different for each company depending upon their industry, depending upon their maturity, depending upon the product, the competitive priorities of the different industry segments. Commodity versus fast fashion is a classic example, but we would like to be able to refine this maturity model that can fit across the board for organizations regardless of where they are and how they would move forward to that agile quadrant, the top right-hand quadrant in our model. And lastly, create recommendations for managing the organizational and the resource challenges that companies are grappling with. So how do they actually go through this process dealing with the resource challenging that they have? Because at the end of the day, it is dealing with financial constraints, it's dealing with talent constraints, people constraints, current processes in place. How do companies realistically implement this maturity model and this transformation to actually deal with the organizational and research challenges that they have? And the question that we have is, where are you going? That I think as listeners you need to think about, what capabilities do you need most? Do you need visibility? Do you need analysis, efficiency, agility? Should you be focusing on the customer experience? And that's going to drive in terms of the technologies that you have. The other question that you need to be asking your organization, where are you on the maturity spectrum that we looked at? Are you digitized? Are you connected? Are you intelligent? Are you adaptive? And you really cannot move to the intelligent or the adaptive if you don't have digitized content. We sort of assume that it's there. And as I had mentioned at the onset, we did not find a single company during our study that had real-time access to digitized content. There was a time lag. Then are you connected? And you have to be connected before you can have insights and intelligence. So I think understanding where you are will tell you where you need to go to move forward to ultimately get to the adaptive component. Third item, what does the longer term roadmap look like for you? And as Morgan had mentioned, there needs to be an overarching roadmap rather than these siloed projects. And last item, we are here to help. We have been working with dozens of companies. We have taken deep dives into certain companies, and anybody listening who is interested in being part of this project, we are happy to move forward with you and to include you into this research as we move the research into the first steps, as you have seen, you can see here on this slide.
Morgan and Nada, thank you so much for your time. That includes today's presentation. We are all out of time. If you had any questions, they will be forwarded to the presenters. If you have any additional questions or you'd like to get in touch, please direct all your questions to research@ascm.org. All content and materials included in this online event are the property of ASCM and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.